What's up, family? Welcome back to the channel for another conversation. And today we're going to be talking about another Black atheist. I've made it a point on this channel to kind of highlight some things that maybe have not been as apparent to others, whether you consider yourself an outsider looking in, or whether you wanted to skin folk. There are certain things about Black history that may not be apparent. There are certain things about the roles of Black atheists in Black history that may not be apparent. And so I like to have these conversations every now and then just to kind of promote some names and some ideas that you may not be familiar with, and just to remind you that secularism, free thought, skepticism has always been a part of the fabric of humanity. And, it's growing, thankfully, which is in part, I am evidence of, right? I wasn't a person who was raised non-religious. I wasn't a person who was raised in free thought or skepticism or critical thinking, for that matter. I was raised in indoctrination, cultural indoctrination, that I then took the step further and embraced communal indoctrination, which meant that I was what's the word? I was submerging myself, inculcating myself with church community, driving that indoctrination further and further. And yet here I am. Indoctrination seems to be losing its grasp because I'm not the only one. And remember, I wasn't just a believer. I wasn't just a faithful servant of the Lord. I was a pastor. I was a leader. Hallelujah. So that's all the good stuff. Great things are happening, blah, blah, blah. But the big point here is that I think some people have this worldview of just like, oh no, atheism, especially when it comes to Black people, it's just a one-off thing, or it's just a new thing, and I'm like, oh man, atheism has a long history in Black and African thought. And so I want to do my best to kind of platform that in the most responsible way that I can. All right. So before we jump into this conversation, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, hit that alert notification, consider supporting, connecting, or joining this community channel or our content in whatever way that makes sense for you. And of course, check out our merch because it's dope, right? We have dope merch. It is what it is. But then we also have books. I can never get the thumbs right with the books, but we have books. Darante LaMar, Darnea Doris, that side is Darnea. And books, you can find our books wherever they're sold. Christ Held Up is my newest one. And it's actually my most popular. It's a very short read. And it's for those of you who want to get a better understanding of eschatology. It's particularly the return of Christ, the second coming. That's what we're dealing with there. And why even expecting a second coming may be the problem in the first place, even from a place of respectful biblical dialogue. So check that out if you're interested. All right, if you have not guessed by today's graphic, we're talking about Zora Neale Hurston. Yep, Zora Neale Hurston was an atheist. Let's talk about her. Her atheism was an integral and explicit part of her worldview, especially in her later writings. Hurston's skepticism of organized religion is supported by her rejection of a personal interventionist God and her critical view of religious institutions, particularly Christianity, which she saw as reinforcing social hierarchies, racial oppression, and moral conformity. And all the ways that I agree with her. But I also want to highlight this thing, because people always ask, well, why is everybody attacking Christianity? Why aren't you attacking Islam? Why would she speak more about Christianity than any other religion? Well, it's because her father was a preacher. So she grew up in Christianity. See, what the things that Christians don't seem to understand is that you should only attack the things that you know about. Yeah. So anyway. So Hurston openly questioned the existence of God and rejected the traditional Christian worldview in her autobiography, Dust Tracks on a Road. She was deeply critical of the idea of divine justice, particularly the notion that human suffering was a part of a divine plan. She considered religious dogma to be a form of control, particularly over marginalized communities. This reflects a broader theme in her life: individualism and self-reliance over submission to religious authority. Yeah, yeah, and this one has kind of become a broader theme in my own life, and it's interesting because, and we'll kind of talk through this more, but we have I think we have one of Zora's books behind me. I don't know if it's on this shelf or the other one, but I was not a fan of Zora Neale Hurston's work coming up. And I think it's because I was introduced to her work later. Like I was introduced to Frederick Douglass's work early. I was introduced to Booker T. Washington's work early, but that's primarily because I used to walk to the library every day as a child. Um, and so like I'd find these different books, but I didn't find Zora's books until after I was kind of fully inculcated in Christianity. And so by then I found her writings to be deeply uncomfortable as a Christian, as a believer, because she just made Christians look so bad in her books. Now I know why, you know. But as an anthropologist, Hurston's approach to religious practices, particularly African and Afro-Caribbean religions such as Voodoo, is one of respect for their cultural significance rather than as spiritual beliefs she personally held, which is a large misnomer. People, or yeah, think I was looking for a different word there. But people often assume that because she did research on voodoo and celebrated voodoo cultural practices, that she herself believed in the spirituality of voodoo, and she didn't. And that's sometimes a hard line to walk in any cultural group where secularism has kind of won out, if you will. Is there is still a deep-seated appreciation, as there should be, for cultural expression, cultural history, and cultural evolution. And many of these practices can be preserved for those reasons alone. Not all of them, for sure, but many of these cultural practices can be preserved for that way of history preservation, if you will. Yeah, yeah. Like, remember when we used to believe that this was real? And like, we don't now, but it's still cool to do, to remind ourselves that this is how we thought about the world. This was a part of our evolutionary journey, as a people, as a culture, as a community. Yeah. And so, her studies of these religions in Haiti and the American South, documented in the works like Tell My Horse, show a deep understanding of how religion functions in human societies. Yet she maintained a personal detachment from faith, focusing instead on its sociological and cultural implications. And one of the things that I did want to highlight here is that I love the fact that Zora focused on these Vodun or voodoo um, um, practices, not just in the Caribbean, but also in the American South, because that's another thing that's not fully understood. When we think about voodoo, we think of it as something that only developed um, in in like Haiti and just in that area, and it's just like, oh, no, 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 no. This is West Africa. This is South America. Particularly East South America, and this is the Caribbean, and this is the American South. And that the practice of voodoo, it was so integrated into culture of the American South, that it was often hard to determine Christianity and voodoo, because Christianity is a highly syncretized religion, and so every group that is attached itself to it has integrated its own ideologies into it. Now, here's a little unknown fact, a little fun fact. This one isn't in my notes, but a fun fact. Many mega pastors in the South today still go see a voodoo woman once a year. Very interesting, right? I was shocked and appalled when I found this out. I was like, the nerve. My righteous indignation was on one that day. But no, this is a very common thing. But also, many of us who grew up in the South, or whose families have been in the South for quite a while. Many of us have great grandparents who were what we call root workers, which were people who operated in this practice of voodoo. My great great grandmother, Julia. Yeah, she was a root woman, medicine woman, but it was pretty popular. It was so popular that it was a part of the everyday conversation, especially like throughout the 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s. So because you can hear people talking about it in a lot of our media, like to this day. You know, you talk to a black man in the South who's dating a woman, and you tell him don't eat her spaghetti, and he knows exactly what that means. And you know, these are things that have traces and these type of ideologies. So, which and those things from a sociocultural perspective, I find that to be absolutely fascinating. You know, so sometimes even when I'm talking about religion and highlighting the foolishness of the religion, I do try to bring in the nuance of us understanding like how we got here, because I'm fascinated by that. But to me, that's what intelligence is. Intelligence is having a curiosity, you know, a fascination about the things around you, to want to know more. You know, I encourage people to get out of that soldier mindset and get into that scout mindset. You know, the soldiers always defending themselves, you know, which really means you're being motivated by fear, you know, not fascination. Oh, that was good. Those are bars. Okay. I'm going to have to remember that nugget. Yes. So I read that. All right, let's roll. Let's roll. Hurston's anthropological work reinforced her atheistic views by emphasizing human agency over divine intervention. She portrayed religious practices as coping mechanisms for the struggles of daily life rather than evidence of any divine interaction. For example, while she respected the cultural importance of voodoo, she did not subscribe to its spiritual claims, viewing it instead as a system of beliefs that help people navigate their social and environmental perceived realities. Now, Hurston's atheism is also revealed through her critiques of Christianity's influence on African American communities, which, for those of you who kind of know my story, if you've seen it on other interviews, then you know a major part of my deconversion, because I was already deconstructing, but a major part of my deconversion was having to be honest with myself about Christianity's influence on African American communities by starting with its influence on myself, my family members, the ones that I was born into, and the communities that I've lived in. She expressed disdain for the way religious leaders often use biblical narratives to justify subservience and suffering, particularly in the context of slavery and racism. This critique is evident in her literary works, where she often portrays religious figures as manipulative or hypocritical, using their authority to maintain control over others. So her critique of religious figures is most evident in her novel Jonah's Gourdvine. In the book, the main character, Reverend John Pearson, is portrayed as a deeply flawed man who manipulates his congregation. Although he is a powerful preacher, he uses his charisma to control others while engaging in hypocritical behavior, such as infidelity. There's at least 10 popular pastors whose names just popped up in my mind that quick. A few of them, some of you probably thought of the same names. But this depiction reflects Hurston's broader skepticism of religious authority figures who uses their positions for personal gain while preaching morality and submission to their congregations. And this occurs so much that this has become a almost like a necessary trope in Black media. Like almost every show in Black media that is about a church has a pastor committing infidelity. You know, just almost every single one of them, because it's such a common trope. Another example is Their Eyes Were Watching God, where Janie's second husband, Joe Starks, becomes a domineering figure, using both his political and quasi-religious power to control the town and suppress Janie's independence. Though not a preacher, Joe represents a hypocritical authority who is revered by the townspeople, but uses that power for his own control and ego, rather than for the community's good. And yeah, that was Their Eyes Was Watching God was a hard one for me when I was still a believer, because I don't know, I like to read, and I'm pretty good at reading between the lines, and it was very clear to me that the point of Their Eyes Were Watching God was that their eyes wasn't watching the stuff that they should have been watching. You know, And as a Christian, that was offensive to me. Because, like, no, you're supposed to keep your eyes on the prize. You know what I'm saying? You're supposed to keep your eyes on Jesus while you're walking through that storm. Don't you put your eyes on the waves that could overtake you. Keep your eyes on Jesus. Like, that sounds like a setup. Just saying. But anyway, in Moses, Man of the Mountain, Hurston reimagines the biblical Moses as both a political and religious figure who manipulates his followers. She portrays Moses as a leader who uses magic and fear to maintain control over the Israelites, reflecting her critique of religious figures who use their authority to manipulate the masses for political purposes. These examples highlights Hurston's nuanced exploration of religious authority figures who wield power for personal or political advantage, illustrating her broader critique of organized religion's control over individuals. And of course, we've seen that organized religion, of course, when it comes to the Black community, not just come from the church, but also come from almost every political institution that claims to support Black people. There's always this overtly religious or quasi-religious undertone, as if only religious people can represent Black people, which is offensive, especially when you actually explore the careers of some of these religious politicians and you actually set this thing up against some benchmarks of standards. It's sadly disappointing. In her essay, Religion, she wrote, "I do not pretend to read God's mind. If he has a mind, I do not know." This illustrates her skepticism toward the idea of a personal, knowable deity and reflects her larger rejection of Christian theology. Now, Hurston's rejection of organized religion aligns with her humanistic values, which prioritized individual autonomy, cultural expression, and human agency over divine intervention. Her work emphasizes these themes while questioning religious authority. She believed in the importance of human experience, creativity, and culture over religious dogma. Her characters frequently find strength in themselves and their communities rather than in prayer. That is particularly true in her most famous novel, Their Eyes Were Watching God, where the protagonist, Janie, embarks on a journey of self-discovery that is driven by her own desires and choices rather than religious guidance. And again, that was a thing that was very clear to me in the movie and in the book. And I think that was Holly Berry in the movie. But to shift away from religious guidance, to stop focusing on God and start paying attention, which ended up being my like 2014 to 2017 realization. It's like, damn, my eyes have been watching God. I should have just been paying attention. Just like Jesus, take the wheel. Nah, I got it. I'll take the wheel. But Janie's journey represents a profound departure from traditional religious thinking. Her self-discovery is deeply personal and independent as she increasingly relies on her own instincts and desires rather than external religious or societal expectations. Throughout her marriage, Janie moves away from the notion of being controlled or directed by authoritative figures, both religious and marital, which in the context of the story, you can tell that there's a connection between the idea of marriage and the idea of religious compliance itself. Her final relationship with Tea Cake and her ultimate decision to choose solitude, rejecting marriage and religion, symbolize her liberation from external religious and societal pressures. She seeks fulfillment based on her own experiences, emotions, and choices, rather than subscribing to rigid moral or religious codes. And maybe I was mad at the ending of that because she chose not to get married anymore. And I was like, but I want to marry Janie because it was Holly Berry, you know? But anyway, this represents a shift in Hurston's writing from religious determinism to personal autonomy, as Janie's quest for fulfillment is one of inner reflection and self-directed purposes. While religion traditionally provided frameworks for morality and decision-making, Janie's actions and choices reflect an embrace of personal freedom over imposed beliefs or divine guidance. This liberation from traditional thinking is a hallmark of the novel, showcasing Hurston's humanistic and secular themes. And I think what was really good here is that the novel and the movie did a great job of highlighting how the presupposition was that religion provided the frameworks for morality and good decision making. And the character in the beginning is struggling to accept that and eventually realize that it's foolish to accept that. And that's why life isn't working for anybody else, which is, just wow, powerful. Hurston's atheism is also tied to her quest for authenticity, both personally and in her portrayal of Black culture. She rejected what she saw as the imposition of Christian morality on African American communities, instead celebrating the rich cultural traditions that existed independently of religious orthodoxy. Her emphasis on folklore, storytelling, and communal life in her work reflects her belief in the power of human creativity and expression. Her atheism and quest for authenticity are deeply intertwined with her portrayal of Black culture, as seen in her rejection of the rigid Christian moral codes imposed on African American communities. In works like Mules and Men and Tell My Horse, Hurston celebrates African American folklore, spirituality, and traditions that exist outside the bounds of Christian orthodoxy. She embraced the richness of these cultural expressions as an authentic and autonomous, emphasizing storytelling, community rituals, and oral histories over religious dogma. Her focus on these traditions highlighted human creativity and cultural heritage, unmediated by Christian moral frameworks. Which that one, even when I was a young minister, that was something I wrestled with. Even when I was a young Christian, it was something that I wrestled with, because a lot of times, especially when it came to imagery stuff, I ended up growing my hair out in ninth grade, just because I could, because prior to that, no one in my family, would allow me to do so. It wasn't a Christian look. And then I began to realize that their idea of Christian just literally meant like tidy European, but and just to be clear, Europeans did that to each other too, because they like long hair too, but But so of course, in addition, Hurston's decision to document and preserve African American folk traditions without filtering them through a Christian lens underscores her belief in the power of cultural expression. She saw the authenticity of Black cultural life as something separate from religious doctrines often forced upon African Americans by white Christian institutions. This commitment to preserving cultural authenticity over religious conformity is a key example of how Hurston's atheism shaped her literary and anthropological work. Now, Zora's atheism and rejection of religious orthodoxy were met with a range of responses, as you could imagine. During her lifetime, many within both African American community and the broader literary world were taken aback by her frank dismissal of religious beliefs, particularly since much of the Black community heavily relied on Christian faith as a source of solace and resilience. Some contemporaries and critics viewed her views as controversial or radical, given the prominent role of religion in African American identity and culture, which I do want to highlight there. That's, that benefits somebody. For religion to have a prominent role in African American identity and culture, that benefits somebody. Think about that. However, Hurston's focus on personal autonomy and rejection of religious submission also garnered respect from secular thinkers and humanists who saw her views as empowering and deeply aligned with the principles of individual freedom and cultural authenticity. Now, here's a fun fact about Zora Neale Hurston. She opposed integration based on pride and her sense of independence. In her own words, she would not bow low before the white man, and claimed adequate Negro schools already existed in 1955. Now, she's not the only one to have made that claim, and she was not wrong about that claim. But well, I do want to highlight this because some of the most important, involved, and invested voices of Black history have been silenced through the propaganda of Christ washing. This is one of the reasons that the civil rights movement had so many detractors historically, because they realized that sense was being slaughtered on the altar of submission and subservience. There is so much more nuance to our story here, and you're going to have to hear from everybody to get a better picture. I did want to highlight this fun fact, though, because what you will find is that when you do start exploring the Black atheists who lived through these moments, the Black free thinkers who lived through these moments, the Black intellectuals who lived through these moments, you will find that many of them had common ideologies about what needed to happen in order to create a strong African American community, or rather a strong African community on the American continent. You know, they had very different opinions than what gets popularly promoted as this is what all Black people wanted. And that is primarily because of Christ washing. You know, even the language of Dr. King was primarily Christian language, had nothing to do with actual liberty, just had everything to do with, I want to be treated like your friend. Yikes. You know, I have some hard thoughts here, but when you consider how bad the Christ washing has been in Black history, and then when you consider the things that we've called victorious that have no wins, and why we won't go back and properly interrogate history to see where did we zig when we should have zagged. You know, it's like we keep pretending like we've been doing shit right when we haven't. I don't like that. I don't like that. We've literally ignored the voices of the most involved and invested of our times. I've shared with you about Philip Randolph. He's the architecture of the Million Man March, the architecture of the Civil Rights Movement. And we ignored his voice. We only listened to W.E.B. Du Bois as long as he was being promoted by the NAACP. The moment his words stopped lining up with their plans, he got Christ washed out like the rest of them. You know, it's very interesting. But speaking of which, I do want to hit Zora's. I do want to hit some of Zora's political views. Hurston was a Republican who aligned herself with the politics of the old right, and she was also a supporter of Booker T. Washington. Although she once stated her support for the complete repeal of all Jim Crow laws, she was a contrarian on civil rights activism, and she generally lacked interest in being associated with it. In 1951, she criticized the New Deal by arguing that it had created a harmful dependency on the government among African Americans. And she also argued that this dependency ceded too much power to politicians. She criticized communism in her 1951 essay titled Why the Negro Won't Buy Communism, and she accused communists of exploiting African Americans for their own personal gain. There's a little bit about Sister Zora that you probably didn't expect to hear. Her legacy of atheism and humanism has become more widely recognized in recent years, especially as discussions around secularism, Black identity, and human agency grow. Her rejection of religious dogma, paired with her celebration of African American culture and folklore, has inspired generations of secular humanists, especially within marginalized communities. Hurston's emphasis on personal responsibility, individuality, and cultural authenticity challenged traditional narratives of dependence on divine intervention, encouraging self-reliance and personal empowerment. Her work continues to resonate with those advocating for autonomy and the embrace of cultural identity outside of religious frameworks. Many contemporary scholars, writers, and activists see Hurston's work as Hurston as an early figure in promoting secular humanism, particularly within Black intellectual thought. Her refusal to conform to religious norms and her dedication to portraying the richness of African American life outside of Christian frameworks have solidified her place as a trailblazer in both literary and secular communities. Zora Neale Hurston's atheism was a clear and defining aspect of her worldview, deeply intertwined with her rejection of religious dogma and her focus on human agency. In her autobiography, Dust Tracks on a Road, particularly in the chapter on religion, Hurston expressed a direct disdain for theism and religious belief. viewing prayer as a cry of weakness and embracing personal responsibility over reliance on divine intervention. She rejected the notion of submission to a higher power and instead advocated for self-reliance and accountability within the natural world. Hurston's writings, including her anthropological work, reinforced her secularism by focusing on the authenticity of African American cultural practices independent of religious orthodoxy. She often criticized the imposition of Christian morality on Black communities and celebrated cultural traditions that existed outside Christian frameworks. Her emphasis on folklore, storytelling, and communal life reflected her belief in human creativity and expression as foundational to identity and agency. Her atheism was not just a rejection of a personal God, but a critique of any system that limited human potential or imposed conformity. In this way, Hurston's works are a testament to her belief in human strength, resilience, and the power of cultural authenticity. Her approach to life and literature emphasized individuality and creativity over religious submission, making her a pivotal figure in both secular humanist traditions and African American cultural studies. I'd like to close this conversation out with a direct quote from the legend herself. "Prayer seems to me a cry of weakness, an attempt to avoid by trickery the rules of the game as laid down. I do not choose to admit weakness. I accept the challenge of responsibility. Life as it is does not frighten me, since I have made my peace with the universe as I find it and bow to its laws." Wow. So now we've learned a little something together about Hurston. And I hope you've taken something from this. I hope this has given you some insight. I hope this has given you a better view of the nuance and the complexity of Black thought, Black free thinking, and the Black community at large. I hope you see now, or maybe are beginning to see, that atheism has always been a very, very visible thread within the movement, the progressive movement of the Black community, especially when it comes to America. I'd remind many that some of the first people who fled slavery were likely people who had rejected religion. All right, thank y'all for hanging out with me for this time. If you haven't already, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, hit that alert notification bell. Consider supporting, joining, or connecting with our community channel or content in any way that makes sense to you. And then, of course, check out the merch. I think that's all I have. So until next time, I love y'all. Keep rising, stay progressive, and if you can, stay beautiful. I'll holla.